I remember as a child discovering the Chronicles of Narnia books on a library shelf. Inside each book there was a map, black on white, detailing the location where that story would take place. You'd need all the maps if you wanted to get a fuller sense of Narnia. Each map a promise of a land to explore, a taste of the world's history, a reference point to follow the characters on their grand quest. Another step to convince you that all this was actually real. Now, as an adult, I still get a kick out of seeing a map in a new fantasy novel. I think that's one of the many reasons I was so drawn to Final Fantasy VII, my introduction to RPGs back in the day. A few hours into the game, the story plants you outside Midgar, the colossal city you covered an entire story in, now rendered as a small construct in a much larger world. The sense of scale was overwhelming. Away from the smog, away from the eternal night, there was a world of its own, almost like stepping through that wardrobe to Narnia. I knew every inch of that map. Travelling it made me appreciate the planet's nature. It played into the corporation versus planet angle, made me fearful for what could be lost. It put me in the shoes of Avalanche, I guess. Made me stop and witness the world's beauty before my eyes. And yet, back in that starting zone, there were constraints. The Midgar Zolom sealed off the mountains, the ocean horizons, hinting at a wider world beyond. Just like those maps in those books, I only had a piece of the puzzle, but I wanted more. It was the promise of adventure. As I looked to the older games to explore Final Fantasy's history, I was pleased to see that the world map was an inherited quality, not just something unique to Final Fantasy VII, or Final Fantasy for that matter. Traversing each world was like unwrapping a gift. I'd worked a little bit harder in the game just to see what else was over that hill. Sure, the world map was a mechanic to get you from A to B, but it could also be a storytelling camera angle, used to serve world building and plot development. Like in Final Fantasy VI when Kefka unleashed hell upon the planet. In Final Fantasy IV where you travel to the moon and a new map is revealed, instead of just dumping you in an endgame dungeon and calling it the moon. Or even in Final Fantasy VII when Meteor appears. The fact that the maps were already established allowed for a cinematic window to explore these natural or unnatural actions and disasters, and their fallout. I'm not sure dumping Cloud at the start of each new town or area would have had the same effect on me. I was actually able to walk from coast to coast, choose when I'd appreciate one town or the next, backtrack on a whim, write my own story. I was a traveller, a drop in an ocean. I felt that. How could my actions ever change the fate of this entire world? The world map forced me to consider the wider external, the planet and additional character. Final Fantasy VIII starts you on an island. That's all you see. You get a sense of scale of the world from there, and the fact that the characters need a car to reach the nearest town. There's a train link, the track disappearing underwater. You feel isolated, yet this is your home. Almost as if a full story could develop here. That top-down view of the water surrounding the island is probably more powerful than the player slowly finding the island's edges in an open world. Instead, by virtue of the world map view, our situation is more readily communicated. In Final Fantasy IX, to reach the outer continent, you travel under the ocean via the underground tunnels. The world map is another character, presenting obstacles to overcome, be they topography or even the mist. When you appear on the other side of the ocean, the world map still makes you feel connected to every place you've been before and every place you're yet to travel, rather than giving you the feeling that you've been loaded into a new zone, built separately and independently, totally and tonally detached from all that has come before it. Yeah, at the time when I fell in love with Final Fantasy, world maps were the gift that kept on giving. Near the turn of the millennium, Final Fantasy X represented a shift for the series in many ways, one being the absence of an overworld map. It's interesting that X's story was all about moving forward on a pilgrimage, never backtracking, almost as if the plot discouraged exploration. Did that inform Squaresoft's approach to a fast travel style system, a system that only truly opens up once you obtain the airship late in the game? In 13, the characters are fugitives, which could also be said to inform the keep moving forward, don't stay exploring too long design. But I think 10 did a better job of addressing linearity. 10 had a natural, evolving flow to the world that carried through each location, and by the end of the game, you can backtrack to each point if you so wish. 12 does a decent job of making you feel the arduous journey through varied locations that feel connected. I'm reminded of the road to Arcades, travelling through the Salika Wood, the gradual transition through the great stone gates into the Fawn Coast, and onto the long and formidable Soshin Cave, only to rise into Old Arcades, in the back of an alleyway somewhere. Even in entries like 10 and 12, there is at least a visible map so you can get your head around the geography of the world. If you're writing a story set on another world, a map is a great way to keep track of fictional geography, to give you a sense of distance that characters travel, but it also helps you design any geopolitical conflict that may affect the story. A map for a fantasy writer is important, whether it's something you end up sharing with your readers or not. Does such a map exist for 13? I'm not sure if one was ever published, or if the developers had one behind the scenes. Maybe that's one of the reasons why I found 13's locations so forgettable and can barely remember the journey between those points. In response to fan backlash around 13's more obvious linearity, Square Enix opted for an open world approach with 15. They even created a clay model early in development to help them decide what areas could be reached by car. Although I think this is one example where the actual contents of that world, i.e. towns and people, do all that world sculpting a disservice. Everything in Eos feels so homogeneous, same diners, same vibe, big empty spaces. I remember sticking the car on autopilot and checking my phone while I listened to the music and waited to reach my destination. That's funny to me because a true open world was probably always the dream most gamers had, to walk the length and breadth, to experience new, unique and exciting things as they journeyed. Yes, I think as technology continues to improve, and we've experienced some huge realms in gaming, there's probably a certain measure of open world fatigue at the moment, and I often wonder if it's because those worlds simply aren't interesting enough. In the older games, the small world maps showed their creativity. Areas would be bordered off in innovative ways. The lands were never a tremendous chore to travel across due to their condensed size, but because of the random battles along the way, I was relieved to reach the next location. But I guess, ultimately, everything is a form of linearity in some fashion. It just depends how it's dressed up. So what's missing by using the open world approach? Is it just a feeling? World maps are just a magical legacy, and I guess losing it is another step away from the thing we fell in love with. For all their charm, I'm not so deeply attached to overworld maps that I can't see beyond them. For example, I loved how the first Xenoblade Chronicles world unfolded in interesting ways. The journey felt epic in scale, and held my attention at the same time. Recently, I enjoyed exploring the world of Elden Ring, yet I'm aware that many were put off due to its intimidating size alone. And I play those Souls games always with the assumption that I'm one of the last people alive, so I'm fully prepared to explore a dead and empty world. But back to Final Fantasy specifically, I don't feel like having a traditional world map is such an antiquated idea. It's another form of storytelling, of world building, and a fast way to deliver a sense of scale and world character, and often I would rather travel that way as opposed to vast yet bland open spaces. Because whatever I dreamed as a child as far as open worlds, it hasn't quite been realised for me. I guess I know now there's such a thing as too much space, and that becomes uninteresting very quickly. Once I've had a taste of wide open repetitive spaces, I gravitate towards selecting fast travel, always, if the option is available. And yet the contradiction for me is that for some reason selecting a town from a list is not nearly as satisfying as navigating the character across the world by myself. Maybe it's because at the very point you select from the list, you've given up control for that moment. You've taken a backseat in navigating the characters. You've missed out on whatever occurs from A to B, because what happens between A and B was for you to decide out on that world map. So really what I'm asking for is a world, any world, that makes me fall in love with exploration, that continues to reward me with unique and memorable moments. Skyrim, Witcher 3, interesting, sometimes beautiful worlds that can feel almost too empty. Part of that may be a lack of patience on my part as I get older, or perhaps lengthy openness is a byproduct of the genre. Tolkien-esque mammoth journeys of wilderness and empty forests seem a hardwired requirement of fantasy. Final Fantasy 15 had a real opportunity to inject some charm, diversity and character into its world, drawing on some of Final Fantasy's finest assets and imagination, but it failed to deliver. I'm keen to see how Final Fantasy VII Rebirth handles things, given it's set on a world many of us have a strong affinity with. A world that boasted a huge roster of memorable locations, secrets and fun modes of exploration. My ultimate feeling is you could probably achieve a measure of the world's scale through cutscenes and by covering great landmasses, but you'll feel like there's a lot missing in between, parts of the jigsaw puzzle you didn't receive in the box. And maybe that's simply by virtue of us having that amazing experience of exploration and scale back in the original game. By the way, we know that overall maps are a suggestion of how big the world is, but do we see world maps as only an approximation of a real map? For example, in Final Fantasy VII, is there actually a dirt road that winds its way up and down the mountains to and from Junon? If a brand new town shows up in Rebirth, is that jarring? Or were we only supposed to take the original game's map as a suggestion of how big the world is, only showing us locations that were relevant to the plot or gameplay at the time? After all, Crisis Core introduced new towns or locations. And what about the things that don't really make sense? Like how far the Gold Saucer gondola would need to travel from Coral? How do Midgar and Junon facilitate trade between each other if the only way is through the Zolom? I guess there's always room for improvement, and maybe Rebirth can capitalise on some of that. To try sum all this up, I'm not saying a world map makes or breaks a Final Fantasy game, just like I don't judge fantasy novels based on whether or not they have a map. I'm just saying that Final Fantasy stories are typically epic in scope. They envelop the entire world, and the planet itself, or at least its future, is usually at stake. And we need to care about that world, that extra character in the story. Whatever medium is used to show us that, let's make the world an interesting one. Because I don't think the series has quite captured the magic of exploration since Final Fantasy IX. Does Final Fantasy need a traditional world map? Probably not. But has modern gaming proved that there's no place for it in this series? Perhaps some sort of hybrid could work, large open spaces or regions to facilitate towns, battles and secrets, but a world map to cover the long distances in between those spaces. Maybe that would be a middle ground, but hey, what do I know? I'm not a games designer. I'm just a kid at heart, trying to find a way back to Narnia. Now that I think about it, I never ended up reading those books, but I remember the maps.